Professor Miller, we're delighted to have you with us today. Would you please educate us all on the future of due diligence for at least the next few years?
I would like to run through a 1527 training presentation that I've prepared and delivered to a lot of clients and a lot of staff over the last 5 years that will help provide a little bit of why do we even do phase one ESAs. I think that statutory and regulatory background is helpful as practitioners. And then I'm going to highlight what some of those changes are out of the 1527-21 standard. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the resources that we have at SCS that we even saw a little bit on ArcGIS today. And that's going to take about 30 minutes. Okay, so environmental due diligence. Why do we need it? As we think about this, so many times phone rings. I want a phase one ESA, or I've been told I need a phase one ESA. So I just want to change that conversation a little bit. It's why do we need a phase one ESA? We need it. We don't want it. We need it. Environmental risks can be significant, and the potential liability can be very significant. Really does provide protection against contamination liability. And frankly, failure to do good environmental due diligence could expose the property owner, the lessee, into significant cleanup costs. Those risks can be substantial. If we're named as a PRP, we're potentially liable for government cleanup costs, potentially natural resource damages. Mike and I just dealt with a natural resource damage claim down in Ohio as part of a due diligence project. We could be on the hook for health assessments. We've got a very significant one going on right now in the state of Nebraska with pesticide-treated seed corn that's been used as a feedstock in an ethanol production plant. Those liabilities absolutely can be substantial. And sites that often look environmentally benign are in fact not. Whether that's a shopping center with a former dry cleaner or a small engine repair shop, there are real risks out there. Downtown redevelopments, etc. I understand we all have a lot of different experiences, but those risks are real, and that's why we need good environmental due diligence. And if properly structured, we can help our clients avoid those liabilities, and we can help them avoid those pitfalls of those. And so, what are we trying to do? Well, we're trying to avoid situations where our client just bought. And I think we all can agree that anything we can do is of value if we can avoid that scenario. But from a background standpoint, I think it's important that we all understand it's not just about the 4 steps of a phase one ESA. It's not that the bank says I got to have it for the closing statement, but why do I do it? It's the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act. And it really was established to handle those historical sites and get those cleaned up, whether they were the result of a actual release of a hazardous substance, Love Canal we think of, but that's the key, right? CERCLA was born out of a release or a threat of a release of a hazardous substance, or in the case of ASTM 1521, petroleum product. Liability strict, joint, and retroactive. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that frankly, any party can be held liable if they were in that chain. It's not a matter of saying, oh, I wasn't involved. No, it doesn't matter. It's strict liability. You're going to be on the hook if you're in that chain and you didn't go through these processes. So liability, I think, is really important to think of in the context of CERCLA as we talk about that. And who are those potential PRPs? It's past owners and operators of the facility at the time when perhaps they generated or disposed those hazardous wastes. Perhaps it's somebody that was in the chain of title or coordinated or was a transporter of hazardous waste. It could be parent companies. It could be officers of the company that acted as an operator of it. Again, generators, arrangers, transporters, etc. All are prospective or potential responsible parties. So under CERCLA, we had some defenses. It could have been an act of God. It could have been an act of war. And if we had those were defenses against CERCLA liability. Could have been an act or omission of a third party. And that was a legitimate defense if you had no employment or agency or contractual relationship with that, and you exercise due care. The real challenge with that was this concept of contractual relationship. So we now have this 1980 law. We have some statutory defenses against it. And now we're moving forward and we're saying, well, time out. I'm looking at purchasing this facility by the fact that I have an agreement in place, whether that's a purchase agreement, et cetera. I have this contractual relationship. And so what happened was, from a statutory standpoint, SARA, or Superfund Amendment Reauthorization Act of 86, said, well, time out. Even if you do have a contractual relationship, i.e. a purchase agreement, we got to have this innocent purchaser defense under CERCLA. So I have this contractual relationship. It's a purchase agreement. I'm going to buy this real property. I've done my all appropriate inquiry. I've dug in. I've done due diligence. I don't have any reason to know that there was contamination. I have this defense. It's the innocent purchaser defense. To establish that, you had to be able to undertake, time of acquisition, the all appropriate inquiry that was consistent with good and commercial or customary practice. Now, I've been in the industry since '94. I know I have colleagues on this call that were in the industry in '86. What was good commercial or customary practice in 1986? It's a great question, right? So the courts had looked at that and said, well, you had to have specialized knowledge or experience. You needed to take a look at the relationship of the purchase price. You had to get after commonly ascertainable information. But again, there wasn't a customary practice at that point. And so really, I always say that Phase 1 environmental site assessment industry was born in 1986 when SARA came out with the innocent purchaser defense under CERCLA. So our industry goes back to about 1986 from a historical standpoint. And so in 1986, this group of professionals got together and said, well, geez, how do we define good and customary? And I'll tell you that from 1986 to 1994, when I started in the industry, that was probably a pretty healthy debate, because everybody kind of had their own bar of what was good and customary for their geographic location and how they practiced. But ASTM in 1994 developed and promulgated the first E1527 standard in '94. And that was a consensus guidance document, not regulation, not law, a consensus guidance document that said, we as an industry have pulled together our committee. We've developed this standard practice for doing environmental site assessments, and the 1527-94 standard became the definition of good commercial and customary practice in the United States for doing environmental site assessments associated with real estate transactions. That has since been updated over the years. It was updated in 97, 2000, 05, 13, and now most recently back in November of last year, 21. But those really up until 2013 had this catch-22. The catch-22 was no contamination found, no problem, charge ahead. We can claim innocent landowner defense under CERCLA if we find something. But what happened if there was contamination? Well, we could walk away from the purchase, might have some liability there, might lose, earnest money, might lose, a breach of contract if we walked away, depending on how we structured that deal, or potentially we move forward with that deal and potentially be liable. Well, in 2008, the Brownfields Revitalization Act came out, and in there, EPA required a new landowner liability protection, and that was the bona fide prospective purchaser and the CPO, or the contiguous property owner, to fence. And so what that really did was it created an opportunity for the industry to allow these contaminated sites where there was, through our normal customary practice, identified contamination, right? A release or a likely release or a threat of material release of hazardous substances or petroleum products on the property. This now gave us that new landowner liability protection under CERCLA to proceed with that. And so now that idea of you couldn't know or have reason to know about contamination kind of went away. And we've solved that now through the Revitalization Act of 2002. As we wrap that up then, shortly after the 2013 standard was brought forward and updated, EPA, through their all appropriate inquiry rule, actually aligned rulemaking in that rule that said, okay, we recognize the 13 standard is meeting the all appropriate inquiry. And so you could utilize either your own your own approach for all appropriate inquiry that met the rule in 40 CFR 312, or you could follow 13 because 13 was recognized as part of that rulemaking by EPA. Brings us full circle. Right now we're in a limbo, right? All appropriate inquiry rule references 13. We now have a new standard as of November 1, which is the 21 rule. Hasn't yet been identified as meeting the all appropriate inquiry rule by EPA. Will be. And those that are, taking the over under on it, some think as early as Q2. Some think it might take till the end of the summer for EPA to act on that. And I'm interested in our discussion here after the presentation as to what folks are hearing to that regard. So phase 1 ESAs, what is it? It's the process to conduct due diligence to determine prior uses and ownership of the property, the subject property. And really we're interested in whether or not there have been releases or likely releases or a threatened material release of a hazardous substance or petroleum product in, on, or at the subject property. And the current practice, whether that's 2017 or 15, 27, 13, or 21, really has 4 major components. It's the records review, it's the site reconnaissance, it's the interviews, and then ultimately it's the report. With regards to that, practically reviewable, what does that mean? Well, practically reviewable means it's data that can reasonably be reviewed in a usable format. So, if I get data that's, yep, here's the state records and here's every hazardous waste generator in the state, that listing's not real useful. But if it's a listing of here's all the hazardous waste generators that are in your zip code or in that geographic location, that's really reasonably and practically reviewable. This concept of reasonable time is about 20 days. Can I request that record and get it back within 20 days from the agency? Or will they have that record available for me to go into their shop and see it within 20 days? That's reasonable time. But again, they just can't pull out their filing cabinet of 6,000 drawers and say, well, start digging, Mike. It's got to be practically reviewable. The goal of that phase 1 ESA ultimately is to identify the recognized environmental conditions. Again, that's the presence of hazardous substances or petroleum projects on, in, or at the property. Okay? So those 4 major components, where I've taken the liberties to update in red, is where there's some significant discussions we'll have around the 21 standard. But under the site reconnaissance requirements, again, we're taking a look at the site. We're supposed to describe our methodology. I performed a site reconnaissance. I used a grid-like pattern, or I used a serpentine path, or, we have to describe that site reconnaissance, and it's required that we describe that in the report, what we did. It can't just be the old day. I drove by with my Polaroid and took pictures of the property. Photographic documentation has to be included. Folks, I was dumbfounded, and I had to read the 13 standard and the 21 standard and look at the updates several times because I couldn't believe the fact that the 13 standard did not require photographs as part of the report. Now, Obviously, we clearly were doing that at SCS, and I would say the industry at large was doing it, but it was not required. The new 21 standard does require photographic documentation of anything that is of note on the site reconnaissance, and we saw a great example of that by Kayla earlier, or any wreck that's identified. Thou shall have a photograph of that wreck included in the report. So site reconnaissance piece of that. Interviews. We have to do those interviews with past owners and occupants that are familiar with the subject property. And oh, by the way, now under 21, we want to use those also to discuss the adjoining properties. There's a much higher bar now on adjoining properties and the needs for the environmental professional to deal with those. And then the government records piece, it's the federal, state, and local records. And then any additional local records that we have. Really no significant updates there from the 13 to the 21 standard. Historical records. I refer to these as the big four or the main four. It's the aerials, the topos, the fire insurance, and the city directories. We need to document those four records, not just for the subject property now, but for any adjoining property, north, south, east, west. Could be, in a large municipal sized city, depending on the size of our parcel, it could be up to 8 or 12 partially adjoining parcels. We're required under the 21 standard to look at all four of these. And if we don't look at all four of the big four, for an adjoining property, we have to explicitly state in our report why we did not. That's a much higher bar. And so as you're thinking about a 15, 27, 21 effort, and you're looking at a very dense urban area, you might want to take a close look at those adjoining parcels before you price what that effort might be. Because again, we have to take a look at it. And if we don't review them, we have to definitively state why we did not in the report. I see that as a fairly sizable difference. I think a lot of us have done a good job of identifying the historical uses and taking those back for adjoining parcels. Obviously, the additional land records and then the user provided information that comes through that process typically. The written report, I've always said, recommendations are not required by the Phase 1 ESA standard, whether that's the 13 or the 21. Oftentimes, we'll include recommendations to fully address business environmental risks, but there is no recommendation section in a Phase 1 ESA. But there are some key things that the 21 standard is going to require. We now have to explicitly say what our rationale was for determining if something was a wreck, an HREC, or a controlled wreck. We have to explicitly say our rationale. We've determined that this is a wreck because. We've determined that this is an HREC because. That's new under 21. We've always kind of talked about data gaps, but significant data gaps now must be identified in the report. It's not okay just to say, oh, couldn't have this information. We got to call it out as a significant data gap, and we have to identify and explain it. A lot of these things we've done before, but again, photo log. I mean, I thought that was standard. No, it turns out there's a lot of folks that are doing $1,200 ESAs that don't have photo logs under the 13 standard. We have to have a photo log. Component dates have to be identified in the report. This is really interesting to me. We've always talked about the shelf life of a Phase 1 ESA of 1 year and the fact that it has to be updated within 180 days of taking title. But when does that 180 days start? Was the date we issued the report? Was the date of the EDR report? Was it the date of our site reconnaissance? Well, it turns out that it's the date of every major component. And some of us actually put that right in the very front of the report. And it turns out that under the new standard, we will be required to say site reconnaissance, this date. Here's the viability of that. Site records research. Here's the date that was performed. Here's the viability date. It's required now. We have to have that right in our report. And then User responsibilities. Some of us do a really good job in our proposals of saying, hey, there's user responsibilities, by the way. You need to do a lean search. You need to do an activity and use limitations, and I'd like you to provide that to me. Now we have to, under user responsibilities, we have to explicitly state, did we or did we not get that information from the user, and did we review it? That's a new 21 requirement that's got, I think, a little higher threshold, both for the environmental professional, but also to hold as the environmental professional, the user of our reports, accountable for that. This is in the new Phase 1 ESA standard, the 21 standard. This is the simplified rec logic flow chart. I think this is going to be a great tool, not just for us doing our work as the EP, but from a training standpoint. It really boils down to helping our practitioners better understand, is it a de minimis condition? Because we all know, hey, you're going to have some drips and drops, and those are de minimis. They're not really material, and those are not a wreck. The wreck, again, is do we or do we not have a release to the environment that poses a risk? And those are recognized environmental conditions under the standard. And that's what we're after. We're trying to determine, do we or do we not have wrecks? But this also now runs us through, well, if I had a wreck, but it was taken care of, I have no activity or use limitations, and it was done to the current standards. So today I even considered the vapor pathway and et cetera, et cetera. It's a historical wreck. And so this flow chart kind of helps us run through that process. Or, I've done everything, but I have institutional controls. I can never use the groundwater for drinking water, or I've got an engineered cap I got to maintain. It's always got to be a parking lot. It's a controlled wreck. So I really like the simplified rec logic that is now embedded in the Phase 1 standard practice, 152721. So I've got a copy of that I've just pulled in to kind of talk through that piece. Phase 1 ESA, who and when, users, timing, again, 180 days, who needs it. After the closing, I'm going to burn through these and we're just going to get to discussions. But, after the closing, we're not done, right? We still have continuing obligations, et cetera, on that. Ongoing requirements to exercise appropriate care, stop any continuing releases, reasonable steps. Mike McLaughlin's got a great article that he put in the Bar Association newsletter that's available. We got to continue to provide cooperation, state and local authorities, yada, 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 on the ongoing. Lender liabilities, this is kind of a canned package that I use for training. So, lender liability, right? We've got, under that Brownfields Revitalization Act, we have some protections for lenders unless, those lenders come in and start actively managing. And so I kind of go through lender liability, that concept of participating in management that takes away some of that. What isn't included in an ESA? We've got all of these types of issues that aren't included in a standard ESA, but now we have, emerging contaminants and PFOS and PFAS. How do we handle emerging contaminants? So we're going to talk through some of that. Misconceptions, conclusions, circle of liability. That's why we do it. We've got these 3 statutory defenses or landowner liability protections. That's the end of that presentation. Now I'm just going to jump into a few things that's going on at SCS. And then first and foremost, we've developed the technical bulletin. That technical bulletin came out back in mid-January. It's a 2-page document that can be utilized for in-house and out purposes. Competency really does matter. This is not about checking a box, because by golly, when you need to be able to demonstrate that you performed your all appropriate inquiry in accordance with the customary practice, you don't want just the checkbox. You want to make sure that you did it right, because competency really does matter.